This is U.S. history. In case you forgot what class you're in, this is the final week in which you'll be doing schoolwork. The first video of the final week, so hopefully you've turned in all your Week 7 packet and information and picked up your Week 8 packet. The only thing in your Week 8 packet that you'll need to do will be to take the Chapter 24 test. I could have assigned other homeworks and other things to it, but, it is finals week, so, quote-unquote finals week. So instead, you'll just have to worry about taking the one test. There won't be a regular exam, just the one Chapter 24 test. But in order for you to take that test, we need to finish the notes. I'm expecting the videos that we'll be doing this week, it'll be a total of 2 videos. So watch the 2 videos and then take the Chapter 24 test. So let's get right into it. Roman numeral 4, Nixon and the silent majority. Nixon's victory in 1968 brought him back into the forefront of politics, a place to which he once said he would never return. After his failed attempt to win the presidency in 1960, Nixon suffered another defeat in 1962 in a bid to become governor of California. Afterward, he announced to the reporters, "Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to be kicking around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." After he was elected president 6 years later, he found the press very willing to kick him again, as we're about to find out. In a speech during his first year in office, Richard Nixon appealed to the great silent majority of Americans for support. Nixon believed that violent radicals discontent with the status quo were not most Americans. Instead, he believed that the silent majority, and if you need a definition, here it is, the silent majority were those people who were quiet, decent, respectable, and hardworking citizens who wanted only peace and order. Nixon will seek to represent the interests of this majority, this middle America, this middle class. So let's talk about it. Letter A, domestic problems. Number 1, busing. Desegregation in schools had been established in the 1950s, but the actual practice remained slow. The primary reason was because local schools took in students from the nearby neighborhoods, and since most neighborhoods remained segregated, the schools remained segregated. To overcome this fact, the courts ordered the busing of students. Basically, if you need a definition for busing, the idea was the goal was to do this until all the schools reflected the overall ethnic makeup of the community as a whole. It was very controversial. The idea was to bus in students from other neighborhoods to make the school more integrated. That's what busing implied. Why do you think it was controversial? Some people opposed racial integration. They were still racist and they still wanted to keep the school segregated. Some people felt it didn't make sense to send a child to a school miles away when there was a school nearby. What were the motivations that led to busing students? The main goal was to promote integration and to give blacks and whites a better understanding of each other. And do you think it encouraged greater understanding between black and white Americans? In my opinion, at the time, at the beginning, not initially, but definitely now. We can definitely see integration has worked out. We can see, of course, yes, racism still is a factor at our schools to a degree, but it's a much smaller degree than it was back in the 1960s and 70s. We do a much better job at understanding one another here at these schools. But is it perfect? Of course not. Sometimes people protested, mostly blue-collar, middle-class white Americans. Sometimes violence erupted, as in Pontiac, Michigan, where protesters firebombed empty school buses. Nixon tried to slow down integration, but the courts continued to demand busing. In time, many neighborhoods became more integrated, and the practice of forced busing declined. Number 2, there were also economic problems. Nixon inherited a deteriorating economic situation. Johnson had tried to pay for both the Great Society and the Vietnam War without raising taxes. The result was a growing budget deficit, which in turn led to inflation. Growth of inflation and unemployment, which led to what became known as a recession. Nixon tried to control inflation by trimming the federal budget and supporting the raising of interest rates. Inflation remained, however, and unemployment rose, starting off a recession. So to deal with the recession, Nixon came up with what became known as the new economic policy. For those of you taking the notes and you like to be organized, please put new economic policy in coordination with the growth of inflation. So right here is where you would start that sentence, and we'll be good to go. The new economic policy was the name of Nixon's plan to deal with the recession. What did it do? Letter A. It first of all set up a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices. You couldn't raise wages, you couldn't raise prices, everything stayed the same, hence called a freeze. Letter B, he established a board to regulate all wage and price increases. So after the 90-day freeze, then this board would regulate, okay, how much more should these people get paid? How much should these prices increase? And they would decide how that's going to take place. And then third of all, they would eventually replace the mandatory guidelines with voluntary ones. It's interesting to note the results and consequences. Nixon's freeze and mandatory regulations seemed to slow inflation, but they did not reduce unemployment. Also, once the guidelines became voluntary, prices rose again. All of his actions in the NEP were departures from the free market economics supported by his quote-unquote silent majority. They resembled more the policies of his liberal opponents than those of a fiscal conservative. Well, he did promise that he would be a middle-of-the-road type of individual. Well, there we go. Letter B, let's talk about some of his diplomatic successes. The main man to help out with Nixon's diplomatic success was his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger, you need to know, was Nixon's successful Secretary of State. And also, fun fact, he is the first man that we talk about in history, the only man that we talk about in history, unfortunately, who is still alive today, Henry Kissinger. Look him up, he's still alive. Number 1, China. Nixon's most notable triumphs came in foreign affairs. His greatest success concerned China. Since the flight of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government to Taiwan in 1949, the U.S. had recognized the nationalist government as the legitimate government of China, while the communist government on the mainland was not. Hoping to exploit the tension between China and the USSR, Nixon began talking to China. In fact, Nixon visited China. His visit, the first of any U.S. president, was an enormous public relations success. Television cameras followed Nixon as he toured the Great Wall and other sites formerly off-limits to foreigners. He dined with communist leaders and exchanged messages of goodwill with them. The visit portrayed Nixon as an astute diplomat and able statesman. This helped to establish relations with Communist China. The U.S. endorsed allowing Communist China to join the UN along with Taiwan. Actually, the UN accepted Communist China and kicked Taiwan out. Nixon laid the groundwork for resuming trade as well. A great breakthrough in American-Chinese relations came in 1971 when the Chinese invited an American ping pong team to visit their nation. The Americans, whom the Chinese treated royally, appeared on national television in the United States, touring the sights of China and meeting China's political leaders. The Chinese even had their second-best ping pong team play the Americans so that the scores would not be too one-sided. The Chinese, whose table tennis skills were legendary, won the men's match 5-3 and the women's matches 5-4. Time magazine referred to the event as the Ping Heard Round the World. Ping pong diplomacy, as it was also once called. There you go, guys. If you ever want to become diplomatic relations promoters, maybe just being good at the game of ping pong will be enough for you. Maybe not. Number 2, Soviet Union. Due to the U.S.'s improved relations with China, the Soviet Union was forced to make some concessions with the U.S. They favored a new policy called détente. Definition of détente, it refers to the relaxation of the tension between the U.S. and USSR that had existed since World War II. So they wanted a relaxation of the tension between the two countries. Also, they favored what became known as strategic arms reductions. In the strategic arms limitation talks, also known as SALT, the U.S. and USSR agreed to limit the number of missiles and warheads that each nation had. So they just simply wanted to limit the number of nuclear weapons both countries had. Nixon also arranged the sale of large amounts of grain to the Soviets. Now, considering the fact that Nixon had begun his career as an anti-communist Cold War warrior, many were surprised that Nixon did more to improve relations between the U.S. and the communist nations than any other president. Under Nixon, the U.S. actively sought to develop friendly relations with repressive regimes. And also, I think it was the only reason why it worked was because Nixon had been seen as the Cold War warrior. Had it been a president who would have been soft on communism his entire career, and then we see him being soft again, people would be upset. People like, oh no, there we go again. There goes that softy of a communist. But because Nixon had been known as a Cold War warrior, showing this softness endeared him to more and more people. Well, that's all the material that we're going to cover for today. We have got one more video to do tomorrow. Hope you all have a good day. Be good, do good.